They said every new gravedigger gets tested by the land, but when the rookie vanished on his first night, I knew this wasn't a test. It was a choice, and the ground had made it. Not all graves stay closed, and some shovels aren't dropped, they're claimed. If you hear your name whispered from the dirt, never answer back. The first night he showed up, I could tell he wasn't built for this kind of silence. Not the quiet that hums in your ears and settles into your bones. This kind of silence doesn't just exist, it watches you. He was young, probably early 20s, with that wide-eyed mix of optimism and fear you only see in new hires who think they're starting something temporary. Said his name was Mason, though he mumbled it like it embarrassed him. Showed up in boots that looked brand new, stiff in the ankles, soles that still squeaked on damp ground. His uniform hadn't even been broken in. No stains, no wear, not even dust. I watched him fidget with his gloves, open his mouth to speak, then close it again, like the air didn't taste right. I didn't bother asking why he took the job. People don't end up in this line of work because they love fresh air and flowers. They end up here because they need something the world stopped giving them. A paycheck, a quiet place, a place to disappear. My supervisor told me I'd be training him for a week. Show him the ropes, how to navigate the grounds, which plots need checking, how to handle the machinery, how to write out the tags properly and keep the tools locked tight. Mostly he told me to keep him busy. Keep his hands moving and his mouth shut. That's how they stay useful. It wasn't cruel, it was protocol. And if Mason had any thoughts about it, he didn't say. Just nodded and followed me through the gate that creaked like an old lung. We started in the southeast corner, where the newer graves were laid in straight rows, names still crisp on white stone. The work there is light, mostly upkeep, checking the grounds for signs of erosion, clearing leaves and branches that blow through at night. I gave Mason the rake and let him set the rhythm. He moved awkwardly, like he wasn't sure how much effort to give. I didn't say much, just watched the way his eyes flicked to the trees, to the shadows between the stones, the way he flinched when the wind blew too sharply past his ears. The first time he spoke, it was barely a whisper. Does it ever get to you? Being out here at night? I didn't look at him, just shrugged. Only if you let it. He nodded again, but I could tell that answer didn't help. Not really. By midnight, we'd made our way toward the older sections. The west edge of the cemetery, where the grounds slope down slightly and the stones grow older, thinner. The names faded into marble like the rain tried to erase them. I didn't take him past the northwest boundary. Not yet. That part of the grounds doesn't get visited much. The paths aren't lit. The graves are crooked, sunken, leaning in toward each other like they're conspiring in the dark. I was saving that part for later in the week, when his hands would be steadier and his ears less sharp. But something about that night felt different. I remember the air was damp, but there hadn't been rain. The soil felt too soft beneath my boots, like it hadn't settled right. I made a mental note to check for runoff damage in the morning, maybe lay some gravel near the perimeter wall. Mason didn't say much after midnight. He worked in silence, but it was a nervous kind, the kind that fills in the spaces with questions too loud to ask. Around 1 a.m., he finally stopped raking and looked at me. "What's the weirdest thing you've seen out here?" It wasn't the question that threw me. It was how he asked it. Not like a joke, not like someone trying to pass the time. He asked like he already knew there was something to find, and he was testing me to see if I'd lie about it. I stared at him a moment, then handed him the flashlight. "Check the perimeter lights on the west fence. Make sure they haven't burned out." He hesitated, not because of the task, but because of where. Still, he took the light, adjusted his gloves, and walked off toward the dark edge of the field. I watched him go, counting each step he took like a silent prayer. 15 steps, 20, 30. Then he disappeared behind the rows. I waited. Not because I was worried, he'd be back in 10 minutes tops, but because something inside me told me not to follow. Not yet. I busied myself checking the shed locks, counting tools, anything to keep my hands moving. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I called out once. No answer. Another 5. I told myself he probably got turned around, maybe checking the wrong corner, maybe taking his time to get a feel for the place. I started walking toward the northwest fence. That's when I heard it. The crunch. One sharp, sudden crackle of dead leaves. Then silence. I picked up my pace. The flashlight in my hand felt too dim, like it only showed me what I didn't want to see. As I rounded the last row of crumbling headstones, I spotted something in the beam. The shovel, standing upright, planted perfectly in the soil. Not laid down, not dropped. Planted. No sign of Mason, no sign of footprints around it. Just the tool, sticking out of the ground like it belonged there. like it had always been there. I called his name again, louder this time. Nothing. I swept the area with the light. No movement, no sign of struggle, no scattered tools, no drag marks, no torn fabric. The grass around the shovel hadn't even been disturbed. And the grave in front of it, God help me, the grave wasn't closed. I didn't see it at first. But as I stepped closer, I realized the earth had been turned. Not freshly dug, not obviously tampered with, but sunken, slightly, like something had been removed, or had left on its own. I took one step back, then another. And for the first time in over 20 years working these grounds, I felt it. Not fear, not dread, recognition, like the soil was remembering me. And it wasn't happy. I didn't sleep that morning. I sat in the tool shed until the sun broke through the trees. No one came looking for Mason. No calls. No report. I told the supervisor he quit, couldn't handle the work, didn't even pack his things. The supervisor didn't blink, just nodded, like it had happened before. Like the cemetery had made a decision, and I'd only witnessed it. I didn't say it aloud, but I knew. Mason didn't leave. He was taken, and the ground had kept something of his to remember him by. A shovel, pointed at a grave, waiting for the next name. The next evening came like a bruise, slow, heavy, spreading through everything. I hadn't spoken a word to anyone all day, not even when I passed the foreman in the break room, or when the admin asked if I'd seen the new guy around. I just shrugged, like it was another routine disappearance, and they didn't question it further. I suppose that's what unsettled me most. How little anyone seemed to care that someone vanished into the bones of that cemetery and left behind a tool like a headstone. There was a silence around the event, but not the kind that comes from grief or shock. It was more like agreement, like everyone had already learned not to ask, and I was just the last fool to catch on. By sundown, I was back at the gate, keys in one hand, flashlight in the other, trying to convince myself to stick to my routine. Just walk the grounds, check the perimeters, log the usual notes in the report binder, and go home before the damp started to settle into my knees. But routines, I've learned, only work in places that want to be understood. The cemetery wasn't one of those places. It had its own pulse, and once you heard it, even once, it stayed under your skin. I tried to avoid the northwest section entirely that night, telling myself I'd check it at the end of my shift. I busied myself on the eastern end, pretending to sweep debris from beneath the benches, running my hands along cold metal trash bins, anything to delay the inevitable return. But the truth was, my mind wasn't on the job. It was stuck on that image, the shovel, upright and waiting, the disturbed earth that sank just slightly, not enough to say something had risen, but enough to say it had moved. I told myself I'd dreamt it, that fatigue had played tricks on me. But when I returned to the shed earlier that afternoon to put Mason's gear away, I found something that made my skin tighten. A second pair of gloves missing, not the ones I issued to him. Those were still in his locker, folded and clean, untouched. No, it was the pair I kept locked in the top drawer, the ones I hadn't used in months. They were gone, and only I had the key. I made my way back to the center of the cemetery as the last smear of orange left the sky. The air felt heavier than usual, the kind that presses against your lungs rather than fills them. I passed the older tombs with their cracked angels and moss-choked names, listening to the gravel crunch beneath my boots. I always found some comfort in that sound. It told me I was still above ground. But when I reached the top of the slope near the northwest fence, that comfort vanished, because the air changed, thicker, wetter, like breathing through cloth soaked in stagnant water. I stopped moving without realizing it, flashlight aimed forward, and waited. And that's when I heard it, the creak, a long, slow groan of rusted iron, drawn out like an exhale. I didn't need to see it to know what it was. The northwest gate. It hadn't worked right in years, always sagging on its hinges, leaning just enough to jam against the post, unless you yanked it with both hands. The maintenance logs marked it for replacement 6 times, but the requests were always ignored or mysteriously closed. Most nights, it barely moved, but now, it opened. I approached slowly, the flashlight's beam flickering against the cold fog that had begun to curl low around the stones. The gate stood open, not fully but wide enough to let a man pass through sideways. I stepped closer and traced my fingers along the edge. The iron was wet, not with rain, but something slicker, darker. I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my coat without looking. Some part of me didn't want to know. The gate didn't close behind me. It stayed ajar, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see if I'd be allowed to return. Beyond the gate, The cemetery sloped into a forgotten corner, older than the rest, a place where the trees grew too close together and the ground sank in strange, uneven waves. There were no lights here, no benches, no plaques with etched names or marble angels, just crude, leaning stones, many of them broken or sunken halfway into the earth. Some bore initials, others had only numbers, and some had nothing at all, just jagged slabs of rock set upright like warning signs. It was in this corner, this unsanctioned edge of the graveyard, that I saw it again, the shovel, still upright, still alone, still marking the same disturbed grave. Only now, it wasn't empty, or rather, it didn't look disturbed. The soil had been smoothed, flattened, as if someone had come back and covered it up, carefully, lovingly, with the kind of precision you don't see in rushed burials. There were no footprints, no signs of tool use, and the shovel was clean, too clean, as if it had never been used at all. I should have left right then, turned around, walked back through the gate, reported the whole thing, and let someone else deal with the paperwork. But my feet didn't move. My breath didn't come. All I could do was stare at the grave that had resealed itself. Then the wind shifted, and I heard it again. The creak. But this time it wasn't the gate. It was closer, lower, coming from the ground. A slow, dragging groan of wood or stone beneath tension, like a hinge trying to turn under weight that didn't belong. I scanned the rows of old graves, flashlight trembling in my grip, until I saw it. Another headstone. Not a new one, not freshly disturbed, but different. It was standing straight now, perfectly straight. The night before, I was sure it had been cracked and leaning. I'd even made a note of it in my log. West section, 3rd row, marker 12, leaning, moss heavy. But now it stood tall, pristine, its surface scrubbed clean of growth. And carved into its face, where there had once been only wear and erosion, was a single word. Yes. I blinked, tried to convince myself I was seeing things, but when I lowered the flashlight and stepped back, the message was still there, and behind me, the gate creaked closed, slowly, softly, like it was satisfied, like it had accepted the answer. Whatever question had been asked, it had received a reply, and I had the sinking feeling it wasn't mine. It was Mason's, or whatever was left of him. I stood there, unmoving, long after the sound stopped, flashlight still trained on the grave that had swallowed a man and given back a message. And for the first time in my life, I realized that not every grave in this place held something dead. Some were still deciding. The next morning I arrived before sunrise, not because I was scheduled early, but because sleep had abandoned me completely, replaced by something quieter and far more aggressive, a dull pulse in the back of my skull, as if something had taken root overnight and was now steadily expanding. I told myself I was going to double-check the northwest sector, make sure I hadn't imagined what I saw, convince myself that fatigue and stress had painted hallucinations on old stones, and that the word yes had been a trick of shadow and moss. I arrived with the gate keys already in my hand, as if some part of me had known I wouldn't be entering through the main path. I bypassed the shed, ignored the maintenance checklist clipped to the wall, and walked straight to where the fence curls along the edge of the marshy woods, where the fog always lingers longer than it should, as though it prefers the company of the forgotten. When I reached the gate, I noticed the latch was still locked. It hadn't moved since last night, and yet I had watched it open, heard it close. I turned the key slowly, more aware than ever of the sound it made, that slow metallic groan that shivered through the iron like breath through rotting lungs. I stepped into the northwest corner again, and everything looked still, but not untouched, like someone had pressed pause on a scene I wasn't meant to witness twice. The same headstones stared crookedly toward the earth. The same twisted trees loomed like sentinels over secrets. But something had shifted, something I couldn't quite name. My eyes went straight to where I remembered the word being carved. The headstone stood as it had before, but the surface was worn again, blank, moss-streaked. The message, if it had ever existed, was gone. I felt the cold in my stomach tighten into something more solid, heavier, like stones pressing against each other in a grave. I turned slowly, scanning the area, until I saw it. The shovel, still standing upright, same place, same unnatural precision, but something about it was different. The handle. It wasn't the one Mason had been carrying. I knew that handle. Worn down on one side from years of use, the initials GC burned lightly into the wood near the base. No, this was newer, darker, not smooth but ridged, like it had been reshaped. The metal head gleamed slightly in the dawn light. polished, unused, untouched. I approached it slowly, feeling the air thicken with each step, and when I stood before it, I saw what had truly changed. The grave. The same one Mason had been drawn to. The same one that had been slightly sunken. It was no longer covered. The earth had been disturbed again, and not subtly. The dirt had been piled neatly beside it, not scattered. The grass that once grew there had been peeled away in a single perfect rectangle, set aside like a doormat. This was not the work of time or erosion. This had been opened, carefully, deliberately, lovingly. I stared into the dark hollow that waited below. It wasn't deep, maybe 3 feet down, but the walls were clean, smooth, no signs of collapse, no roots, just earth, old, packed, hungry earth. I looked around for signs of digging, for tool marks, boot prints, anything that would indicate someone had done this while I was gone. But the ground was pristine, not a trace, no insects buzzing, no fresh scent of disturbed soil, just silence, and the shovel. I reached for it, not sure what I intended to do, maybe throw it, maybe bury it myself, maybe snap it in two, just to feel something I could control. But as soon as my fingers touched the handle, the temperature dropped, not gradually, instantly. The air around me turned heavy, wet, and bitter cold, like standing inside a meat locker. My breath came out in a fog, and the sound of birdsong that had been distant moments before vanished completely. I looked down, and the grave was no longer empty. There was something at the bottom, a cloth, dark, damp, folded like a blanket left on a bench. I stared, unable to move, and then it shifted, just slightly, as if something beneath it had exhaled. I stepped back, hand releasing the shovel, and stumbled into a headstone behind me. I didn't fall, but the cold didn't leave. It pressed into my skin, crawled up my spine, wrapped around the base of my skull. And then, from the open grave, a sound, faint, wet, familiar, a cough. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, to put distance between myself and whatever had made that noise, but my legs refused. I stayed, paralyzed, listening as the cough faded into a rasp, and the rasp into a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, not then, only that they came from the earth. I leaned slightly forward, as if pulled by some invisible tether, and heard it again, closer this time. A single syllable, drawn out, breathless. My name? It wasn't complete, but it sounded like the beginning of it. My blood turned to ice, my fingers numb, and I forced myself to back away, step by step, until I reached the edge of the path that led back to the central rows. I turned without looking again, without checking the grave, without touching the shovel, and walked in a straight line until I reached the tool shed. When I closed the door behind me, the silence felt louder than ever. I collapsed into the chair beside the desk, shaking hands, fumbling for the thermos I always kept in the drawer. It tasted like dust, like soil. I didn't return to that section for the rest of the week. I worked around it, took the long paths, cleaned headstones twice just to avoid being near the northwest fence. But every night, I logged the same note, same time, same phrasing. Section NW, shovel present, grave exposed. And every morning, I read it again, hoping that maybe I'd written it wrong, that maybe I'd dreamed it all. But the note was always there, same handwriting, same ink, like a reminder left by someone who knew I wouldn't forget, but made sure I couldn't even if I tried. Mason was still gone, and now I was starting to understand what that really meant. He hadn't vanished. He'd been taken, chosen, or maybe invited, and now the grave was waiting again, this time with more clarity, more hunger. Because it wasn't just disturbed anymore. It had been fed, and now it had the taste. By the fourth day, I stopped pretending this was something I could brush off. I'd done my best to file it under anomalies, things too strange to explain, so better left ignored. But the grave had a pull now, a gravity that made my steps slower near that corner, as if the ground itself wanted acknowledgement. There was something ritualistic about how it waited, how it revealed just enough each time to keep me coming back. It no longer felt like a place of rest. It felt like a question with no answer, or worse, a question I was supposed to answer. So that morning, after finishing the paperwork I could no longer focus on, and sipping coffee that never warmed my stomach, I went back to the Northwest Records cabinet. It hadn't been opened in years, not since they stopped tracking the older rows digitally. The drawers stuck from rust, and the labels were peeling from moisture. Most of what was inside was handwritten. Brittle, sun-bleached papers filed under codes that made sense only to those long retired or buried. I scanned every section, line by line, searching for the coordinates of that specific grave. Row NW3, plot 14. I knew the spot like the back of my hand now, but finding it on paper was a different story. It wasn't there, not under its section, not under any known designation. I widened the search, scouring every drawer from A to Z, flipping through faded work orders, burial requests, lot sale forms. Nothing. No one by that number. No listing for NW314. I paused only when I came across a folder misfiled under maintenance requests. It was heavier than the others, its tab marked with a name I didn't recognize. Connors, F. Inside was a photocopy of a cemetery map, an older version, yellowed and creased at the corners, with handwritten notes in red pencil. The northwest section was circled, not the whole thing, just that one row, and next to it, scrawled diagonally across the margin, were 3 words, "Do not disturb." Beneath that, in smaller script, a date, July 3rd, 1983. I stared at the page until my eyes blurred, then flipped to the next sheet, a report written by someone named Lyle G., dated the day after. It read like a log entry but sounded more like a confession. Attempted to dig NW314 per order from city registry. Soil beneath top layer refused standard displacement. Unnatural compression. Began to hear muffled sound around depth. 2.3 FT resubmitted work order. Denied. Plot remarked closed. Advised to never return. Shovel retrieved from ground next morning. Handle snapped. There was no signature, no follow-up. Just those lines, scratched quickly, like the writer wanted them out of his hands as fast as possible. I closed the file and checked the remaining ones for anything similar. Other closed plots, unexplained anomalies, forbidden zones. I found 4 more, all from the same section, all bearing the same red markings, and each marked with a tool missing afterward. Rake, spade, crowbar, trowel. Each time, the tool had vanished. That afternoon, I returned to the shed and went through our own inventory list. Sure enough, we had those items logged as replaced due to loss, but no details, no sign-outs, just absence. It was like the ground had a pattern, a habit of taking, a quiet appetite. I felt the walls of the shed close in. My breath tightened, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I saw that grave again. Not just stood by it, but studied it. Looked at the angles, the way the dirt folded, the way the air moved above it. If it wanted to be found, fine, I'd find it. I walked through the fence gate just before dusk, flashlight in my back pocket, gloves in hand. The grass seemed taller now, thicker somehow, like it had grown in defiance of time. As I reached the plot, I noticed something I hadn't before. A second depression beside the grave, not a full one, but an outline, the size and shape of a person lying flat, not dug, pressed, like someone had been lying there beneath the grass and simply disappeared. I crouched and pressed my palm into the space. The dirt was colder than it should have been. Damp too, but not from recent rain. It had rained last week, but this was different. This was the cold of untouched places, the cold of basements and sealed rooms. I turned to the grave and approached it again. This time I walked around it, studying its edges. That's when I saw it. Carved faintly on the back of the headstone, almost invisible unless caught in the right light, was a single symbol, a spiral. Not decorative, etched crudely, shallow and angry, as though done by someone in a hurry, or someone scared. I traced it with my finger and felt a jolt. Nothing violent, more like static, but stronger than what should have been possible from mere stone. I pulled back and turned my attention to the earth again. I scanned for signs of wildlife, insects, worms, anything living. Nothing. The soil was undisturbed now, but lifeless, like it had been sterilized. I stepped away and stood still for a long time. No birds, no wind, just that same pressure in my chest, the one that felt like it didn't belong to me. And then I remembered the sound from before, the cough, the whisper. Was it trying to speak, or was it mimicking? I turned and began walking back toward the gate, mind racing with everything I had just uncovered. Whatever that plot was, it wasn't meant to exist, not on paper, not in the earth, and yet it did. It had been there long before I arrived, long before Mason, long before even Lyle. They had all been drawn to it, lured, and now, so had I. But unlike the others, I had found the records. I had seen the markings. I knew now that this wasn't just an unlisted grave. It was a wound, a buried request. Something had been sealed there and warned against. But warnings fade when left too long, and I had already gotten too close. I returned the next night not out of courage, but because pretending otherwise had become unbearable. Every other section of the cemetery felt artificial now, like a set on a stage, props in a play I'd lost interest in. The rakes in my hands felt like distractions, the calls on the radio like noise to keep me from listening too closely. Because ever since I read that report from 1983, I had the sense that I was already marked. Marked not just by knowledge, but by proximity. That spiral carved into the back of the headstone had touched something in me, like it had found a matching shape somewhere inside my chest. I didn't ask for answers anymore. I knew they wouldn't come the way I wanted. So instead, I brought a chair, the folding kind we use for small funeral services when no one's expected to show. I set it up exactly 3 feet from the edge of the grave. I left my flashlight off and let the night claim the scene. The moon was thin, pale like an eye half-lidded with sleep, and it did little to illuminate the gnarled trees beyond the northwest fence. The grave itself had not changed, still opened, still solemn in its silence. The pile of dirt beside it looked undisturbed, though I knew that meant nothing here. I checked the shovel again. Same place, same impossible stillness. I sat in the chair and waited. I didn't bring a book, didn't check my phone. I just stared at the hole. I told myself that whatever this was, whatever force or entity or memory nested inside that grave, it fed off uncertainty. So I would give it none. I would give it patience. I sat still for hours. The wind shifted once or twice, cold enough to sting my eyes, but I stayed. The usual nighttime chorus of insects had thinned, reduced to brief chirps and distant rustlings, and then it stopped entirely. Not faded, stopped, as though a switch had been flipped. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m., a time I hadn't consciously expected but which rang oddly familiar. Then it came, soft, not from above, but from below. Not wind, not breath. A sound like damp cloth being drawn over stone. Then a whisper, dry, splintered, not spoken with lips, but exhaled through broken space. It said, "He wasn't the one." I froze, not from fear, not exactly, but from recognition. It was the same voice that had tried to speak before, the same pitch, the same brittle edge, and now it had finished its sentence. I waited, blood humming in my ears. The night pressed down on me like wet wool. I tried to steady my breathing. My pulse echoed in my wrists. The silence after those words felt more dangerous than the whisper itself. Then came the second part, a question, asked not with curiosity but with hunger. "Are you?" My name wasn't spoken, but it didn't need to be. The weight of the question was personal, specific. It didn't ask for someone. It asked for me. I swallowed and tried to speak, but my throat was locked. I realized then that my hands were clenched so tight around the arms of the chair that my knuckles had gone pale. The air felt thicker again, like syrup laced with soil. I could taste metal. I stood slowly, not daring to move too fast, and took one step toward the grave. The edges of it seemed darker now, not from shadow, but from depth that shouldn't exist. It didn't look like a hole anymore. It looked like a tunnel, a shaft into something older. I wanted to speak, ask what it wanted, but part of me feared that giving it voice would be agreement, and I wasn't ready to agree to anything, not yet. So I just stood there and listened. The wind picked up again, sharp and sudden. Leaves scattered across the dead grass behind me, but none came near the grave. The pile of dirt didn't shift, but the scent of earth grew stronger. Then the whisper came again, this time not in words, but in emotion. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it landed in my chest like a memory I'd buried. Sadness. That was what I felt. Not fear, not rage. Sadness so old and vast that it felt like a trench carved into time. I saw flashes, not visions exactly, but impressions. A boy with no headstone, a mother weeping alone at a fence, a man placing a photograph against a stone and walking away before dawn. Loss. That's what the voice carried. That's what it fed on. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a root, and nearly fell. I caught myself and looked again into the grave. The darkness had deepened. The spiral etched on the back of the headstone seemed to glow now, not with light, but with memory, like it was remembering itself through me. I gathered my things quickly, unable to stay longer. As I walked away, the whisper did not follow. but I knew the question still hung there, unanswered, suspended in the soil. Are you? It didn't need an answer right away. It was patient. It had waited for Mason, for Lyle, for others before me. Now it would wait for me. The shovel was still standing, and the grave was still open. But now, it knew my name. And worse, I knew its question. The next morning, I arrived before sunrise. Not because I was scheduled to work early, but because I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't sit still in my own home without feeling the weight of that question scratching at the back of my skull. I showered without turning on the hot water, hoping the cold would reset me, but it only sharpened the tension in my shoulders. I drove the whole route to the cemetery in silence, headlights cutting through mist that seemed unnaturally low to the ground, like fog that knew where it wanted to stay. I parked by the east shed, far from the northwest corner, just to give myself a reason to cross the entire cemetery on foot. I needed that walk, needed the friction of my boots against gravel and frost-covered grass, needed the illusion that if I kept moving, I might outrun whatever had started wrapping itself around my spine 2 nights ago. But instead of going straight to the grave, I veered toward the staff break room. Not because I needed coffee. I needed distance from the spiral, from the silence it had grown from. And truthfully, I wanted to find something tangible, something human again. That's when I remembered Mason's locker. It hadn't been touched since he vanished. The night he disappeared, his things were left exactly as they were, like a ghost that had clocked out without taking its coat. The managers hadn't cleared it, maybe out of respect, maybe out of quiet fear. But either way, it stood there like a question I could no longer afford to ignore. I walked into the dim break room, turned on the flickering fluorescent light, and stared at the line of gray metal lockers. His was the third from the left. I reached for the dial and spun it, not really expecting it to open. But the lock clicked, no resistance, as if it had been waiting. Inside were a few folded uniforms, a pair of worn work boots, and tucked behind them, a small notebook, black cover, frayed spine, no label. I reached for it and immediately felt the difference. Cold, dense, like it had absorbed more than moisture over time. I opened the first page. No name, just the date, October 5th. A single line beneath it. Training starts tonight. Hope I don't screw it up. The handwriting was neat at first. Steady. The next few entries detailed basic tasks, moving soil, trimming hedges, learning how to refill the lanterns by the west gate. But the tone began to shift by the third page. Something off about the northwest plots. Feel colder there, not like the rest of the grounds. Thought it was in my head, but Greg mentioned it too. He laughed after. I didn't. The next entry was dated the night before he vanished. The writing had changed. More erratic, letters tilted, some words trailing off. Saw someone. Not a mourner. Standing by NW3, no footsteps in the mud. I said hello. They didn't move. When I blinked, they were gone. Thought it was stress. Tried to laugh it off. But I think the dirt whispered. Not loud, just low, like it was breathing. The page after that was half torn. The edges were jagged, as if ripped in a rush. What remained of the writing was barely legible. Phrases stood out, incomplete. Spiral in the stone. Felt watched from under. Not a grave, a mouth. The shovel moved itself. Then the final entry, just 5 words. The ink was darker, pressed deeper into the paper, as though his hand had trembled or pushed too hard. I touched something. It touched back. That was it. The last line. No signature, no goodbye. Just that sentence, and beneath it, a smear. Not of ink, but something thicker, slightly faded brown. I closed the notebook slowly, my fingers numb around the edges. The silence in the break room had grown heavier. No hum from the vending machine. No click from the overhead lights. Just me and the weight of what I'd read. And suddenly, I knew. Mason hadn't just seen something. He had been chosen, tapped like a glass to see if it would ring, and it had. I sat down on the wooden bench and stared at the book in my hands. It didn't feel like paper anymore. It felt like evidence. Not the kind you hand over to police, but the kind that confirms something you've desperately wanted to deny. The grave hadn't been random. The spiral hadn't been warning. It had been a beacon, a mark, and Mason had answered without meaning to. Now I had his notebook, his words in my hands, and something in me knew that was no coincidence. Whatever he'd awakened, I had picked up the thread. The grave had spoken, the ground had breathed, and somewhere under my feet, something was still listening. The notebook never left my side after I found it. I kept it in my inner coat pocket, close to the skin, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect it. or me, from whatever echo lived inside those words. I didn't tell anyone. Not Charlie, not the office, not even the city inspector who showed up that afternoon to audit the cremation logs. I went through the motions, answered questions, signed the clipboard, but the entire time, my mind was circling that grave again, like a moth around a cracked light bulb, drawn and repelled in equal measure. I didn't want to go back. Every instinct screamed against it, but I knew by then that it was no longer a matter of choice. The journal had passed to me, the spiral had been seen again, and the grave had not closed. That night, instead of following the usual path past the caretaker's cabin and down to the main gravel walk, I took the back route along the tree line, ducking beneath the lower branches and following a path that hadn't been used since the grounds expansion 3 years ago. The moon was brighter this time, but not comforting, just more light to see what shouldn't be seen. When I reached plot NW3, everything was still. The air didn't move. No insects, no birds, not even the groan of old pine limbs in the wind. The open grave looked exactly as it had the last time I saw it, but the feeling around it had changed. It no longer felt passive, like a wound waiting to be cleaned. It felt expectant, like a mouth ready to speak or swallow. I didn't approach right away. Instead, I walked in a slow arc around the edges, flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the dull silver light. That's when I saw the marks. Not fresh, not obvious. But there, in the older stones flanking the open grave, were small notches, tiny spirals, etched faintly into the moss-covered faces of long-forgotten headstones. Some were barely visible, others clearer. A pattern began to form. The spirals weren't just symbols. They were markers, coordinates, almost, pointing toward this spot, this exact plot. The journal had mentioned the spiral as a mark of awakening. But what if it wasn't just that? What if it was a signature, a claim? My breath clouded in front of me, though the air wasn't cold enough to justify it. I turned back toward the open grave and saw movement, not large, subtle, like a ripple in still water. The soil at the base had shifted, not collapsed, shifted. A small indentation, as if something underneath had changed position. I crouched slowly, every hair on my arm standing straight. My hand brushed the ground, not touching the grave itself, just the edge of the surrounding dirt. And that's when the cold hit. Not temperature, but a pressure that crawled through my fingers into the bones of my wrist. An ache that pulsed in rhythm with my heart. I pulled back sharply and fell onto the grass. The pain stopped immediately. I sat there, breathing heavily, and then I heard it again. The sound that Mason had described. Not a whisper, not a voice. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, like something pacing itself deep beneath the stone. I remembered the line from his final entry. Not a grave, a mouth. I stood and backed away, heart racing. But before I could turn to leave, I noticed another mark, carved into the bark of a tree just 10 feet from the grave. A spiral again, larger than the others, deeper, as though scratched by something harder than a knife. I moved closer and saw a date etched below it, 1983, the year from the record, the first disappearance. And beneath that, barely visible through the moss, another date, 2001. That was Lyle's year. The man Charlie had mentioned, he'd vanished, left a boot behind, never seen again. And now, beneath those 2 dates, freshly carved, still showing raw wood beneath the bark, 2025. My stomach dropped. The tree had been marked again, and this time, the date was current. This time, it was waiting for someone new. I staggered back and looked at the grave again. The ripple in the soil had vanished, but the feeling remained, like the dirt knew I was watching, like it had cataloged my scent, my presence, and was simply waiting for the next signal. I turned and walked away without running, because some part of me believed that sudden motion would invite pursuit. I passed headstones that seemed to tilt in my peripheral vision, though they remained still when I looked directly. The spiral had returned. Not just in the grave, but in the very structure of the cemetery. It was in the layout, the tree carvings, even the gaps in the fence. A pattern built over time, hidden in plain sight, feeding perhaps on forgetfulness itself. Mason had stumbled into it by accident. I had followed by obsession. And now the shadows beneath the stone were no longer just a presence. They were a direction, a summons. Something beneath had moved, and its eyes, if it had them, were open. The next morning, Charlie found me sitting on the edge of the maintenance shack porch, boots still caked in last night's dirt, hands wrapped around a thermos I hadn't bothered to fill. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me the way men look at a wounded animal, trying to decide if it's worth saving or if it's already accepted the end. I didn't offer a greeting, and he didn't expect one. Instead, he leaned against the railing, lit a cigarette with that battered silver lighter of his, and exhaled like someone who'd waited a long time to be asked something he hoped would never come. I looked up at him and said just one word, Mason. He didn't flinch, just looked out over the headstones and said, "So it's talking to you now too." That was all. No preamble, no disbelief, just confirmation. I asked him how long he'd known. He tapped the ash into a cracked flower pot and shrugged. Knew it since '83, the first one. I remembered the name from the tree, the first spiral date. A teenager, I think, from the limited notes in the archive. No obituary, no memorial, just an incident report and a replacement on the payroll the following week. Charlie went quiet again, watching the wind twist through the trees near the northwest lot. After a while, he said, "Some dirt don't sleep like it should. You work cemeteries long enough, you start thinking everything's the same. Just plots and stones and names fading slow. But then you find a patch that don't act like the rest. Soil that takes more than bones, soil that remembers." I asked him what it wanted. He laughed, dry, without humor. "Wants got nothing to do with it. It chooses." He turned to me, eyes tired in a way that spoke of decades, not days. "You think it's about good or evil? It ain't. It's not a demon, not a ghost, not some angry spirit looking to settle debts. It's older than that. It's hunger that learned patience. It's ritual that forgot its reason. And every few years, it stirs, it looks around, and it picks." I asked him if it had picked me. He didn't answer, just flicked the cigarette into the gravel and walked back inside, leaving the door half open behind him. I sat there until the sun cleared the trees and forced light over the headstones, like it was trying to disinfect the rot I now knew couldn't be scrubbed. I thought about Mason, about the way his locker felt colder, about the voice in the dirt, about the date carved fresh into the tree. I thought about how I'd spent 2 decades walking this place like it was just a job, how many shovels I'd driven into the earth without ever once thinking the earth might remember. I thought about all the graves marked, "Do not disturb." I realized those warnings weren't for vandals or pranksters. They were for us, for the ones who'd been working the grounds too long, lulled into routine, blind to the spiral forming beneath our boots. Later that day, I visited the grave again, this time with gloves on, not to dig, just to feel. I pressed my palm flat against the rim of the open earth. The soil was warm, not sun warm, breath warm, and deep inside I felt the same slow pulse I'd noticed once before, only now it felt familiar. It wasn't threatening anymore. It was curious, as if waiting, as if considering. I remembered something Charlie said years ago when training new hires. Back then, I thought it was just a creepy old man trying to sound wise. "This place don't just hold the dead, it chooses who gets to leave." That line came back now with the weight of prophecy. I hadn't left, not really. Mason hadn't either. He'd crossed some unseen line, one that I was now towing, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. That night, I stayed behind after everyone clocked out. I sat again by the grave, same chair, same distance. I spoke aloud this time, not to provoke, not to demand, just to offer. "I'm here," I said. "I read what he left. I saw the spiral. I know." No answer, not in words, but something shifted again. The dirt around the edges grew darker, damper. A scent rose, like old rain trapped in cellar stone. And in that silence, I felt it again. The presence, not above, not below, around, in the trees, in the fog, in the spaces between my breaths. I felt it watching, not from one direction, but from all, measuring, judging, choosing. I whispered, "Was it me?" A breeze passed, not cold, not warm, but full of weight. I didn't hear a voice this time. I didn't need to. The feeling was answer enough. The dirt makes the choice, not based on worth, not based on sin, based on something older, something primal. I stood, feeling that judgment pass through me like shadow through smoke, not possession, permission. I walked away, but I didn't feel like I was leaving. I felt like I'd been catalogued, logged in a ledger I would never see. The soil knew me now, knew my rhythm, knew my name, and if it hadn't chosen me yet, it soon would, because now I had seen it, heard it, touched it, and like Mason wrote, it touched back. I remember the moment I heard it, not just the sound, but the weight of it, how it settled into my spine like something wet and old pressing through flesh into bone. It was the 3rd night after Charlie's warning. and I hadn't slept since. Not really. I would lie down and close my eyes, but my ears stayed open, listening for the impossible, for breath in the earth, or fingers on the frame of the shed, for shovels moving themselves or voices shaping syllables in the wind. But that night, I didn't wait for it to find me in sleep. I went back to the grave deliberately, flashlight tucked into my belt, but turned off, boots dragging slower than usual, as if my feet already knew better. The sky was overcast, just thick enough to hide the moon, but thin enough to let its dull glow make everything look like the world had been smudged in charcoal. I didn't take the gravel path. I walked straight through the rows, brushing shoulders against old stones, letting them guide me like ghosts with arms. The grave looked as it always did, still slightly sunken, rim caved in just enough to say no one had filled it properly. But it wasn't the hole that caught my eye. It was what lay beside it, my shovel, not one like it, mine. The wooden handle still had the burned initials I'd carved a decade ago during a lunch break, the metal edge still marked with the bite from where I'd hit the old rebar in Lot C. I had locked it away 2 nights ago. I was sure of it. Had wrapped it in canvas and left it in the tool cage in the rear storage, chained and padlocked. Yet here it was, propped neatly against the edge of the grave like a gift. I didn't touch it. I sat down across from it, knees bent, heart ticking faster with each breath. I waited. And when it came, it didn't start with a voice. It started with a vibration, a low hum, not in the air, but beneath it, like something tuning its throat deep in the root of the land. Then, softly, behind me, my name, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken, like an old friend asking if I was still around. I turned slowly, knowing nothing would be there, but needing to see the nothing for myself. There was no figure, no eyes glowing in the dark, just headstones and fog, and the certainty that one of them had lips. I stood up, breath caught somewhere between a scream and a prayer, and the voice came again, this time from the grave. Same tone, same weight, just my name. No request, no threat, just the act of saying it, as if it wanted to see how I'd react. I knelt by the shovel, not touching it, just examining. There were prints in the dirt, not footprints. These were shallow, spread wide, almost hand-shaped, but the spacing was wrong, as if something had pressed against the soil from below. I reached out, finally, and laid my fingers on the handle. The moment I did, everything went silent. Not night silent, not breathless, dead. Even the air stopped moving, and then I felt it. A presence behind me, towering but incorporeal, not seen but undeniably there, like standing too close to a lightning rod during a storm you know is about to strike. My name again, clearer, closer, deeper. I dropped the shovel. It fell flat against the earth, and the sound it made echoed far longer than it should have. I turned and saw nothing, but it didn't matter. I knew now. I'd been chosen, not for punishment, not for reward, for continuation, for witnessing. I think that's what it wants. Not death, not pain, recognition, attention, to be seen, to be remembered, and maybe to remember us back. I left the grave without the shovel. I walked in a daze through the rows, through the gate, into the maintenance shack, and sat on the floor until the sun rose. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Not with the sound of my name still vibrating in the hollow parts of my skull. That voice hadn't been human. Not in shape, not in origin, but it knew how to form the word that was me. It knew how to say it in a way that felt like memory. Not mine, but something else's. Something ancient. Something beneath. And worse than the knowing was this thought I couldn't push away. It didn't speak to me because I was special. It spoke to me because now I belonged. There's a difference between a grave that's been dug and a grave that waits. I learned that in silence, long after the last voice faded and the last echo of my name had dissolved into the damp breath of the cemetery soil. It was something in the air that changed, a subtle pressure that followed me as I moved through the rows, less like being watched, more like being expected. I returned to the grave where my shovel had been found, expecting more signs, more sounds, maybe even more footprints that didn't match the living. But what I found instead was nothing. It was sealed. The earth that had been disturbed was now perfectly flat, packed, smoothed over as if months had passed instead of hours. There was no indentation, no hint of digging, and the headstone that never existed was still absent. It was as if the grave had healed, but I hadn't. Inside me something had torn open, and it didn't close with the dirt. I walked slowly, as if tracing something I wasn't meant to see but could feel anyway. The cemetery had always been segmented into clean sections, rows of military symmetry broken only by the occasional flower pot or tilted cross. But now I saw things in the layout that I'd never noticed before. How some paths curved slightly toward a cluster of unmarked plots in the farthest corner. How certain trees leaned not with the wind, but away from something beneath. I followed the subtle pull of that arrangement, like reading a code that wasn't meant to be read, until I reached the northern boundary of the property, the place no one ever went. We didn't mow there. We didn't clear snow there. It wasn't technically a burial zone, but I had seen Charlie glance in its direction too many times when things went wrong, always with that same tight expression, like a man staring down a dog he knows is only pretending to be asleep. I stood there now, at the edge of that final row, and I saw it, the grave. It had no headstone, no flowers, no signs of visitation. But the dirt was different, not dug, just waiting. The soil hadn't settled, even though no rain had fallen in days. It was soft, loose, disturbed from beneath rather than above. I stood still, watching for movement, listening for breath, heart crawling up the back of my throat. Nothing stirred, not even the wind. I stepped closer, and every inch I advanced made my skin tighten like it was trying to pull me backward. My boots sank slightly into the dampness around the grave's rim. It was a subtle softness, but it told me something essential. This grave wasn't made for the dead. It was made for the chosen. I crouched and looked at the ground. No marks, no prints, just the suggestion of an outline, not in stone or dirt, but in meaning. As if this grave already knew whose name it would one day bear, even if it would never be carved. And then the sound came, not a voice, not a whisper, a rhythm, a digging, slow, measured, from beneath, not frantic, not desperate, patient, deliberate, like something carving upward not to escape, but to fulfill a purpose. I didn't run. I didn't even stand. I just sat beside it, legs crossed like a child at story time, hands on my knees, waiting to understand what I already knew deep down. I had become part of it, not in death, not yet, but in allegiance. The way priests serve temples, the way shepherds serve fields. I realized then that the cemetery had never been a resting place. It was a system, a cycle, a choosing mechanism dressed in grief and granite. Some graves took, some graves waited, and some remembered. I remembered Mason's name now, not as a man I trained, but as a message. He was the last chosen. I was the next. And after me, who knows? The soil would decide. It always did. I stood, brushed the dirt from my palms, and felt the tremor under my feet stop, like the ground had finished taking measure. I whispered nothing. There was no need. It already knew me. It had spoken my name. I had listened, and in return, it had shown me the empty grave that waits, not to claim, but to remind. I walked away, slow and reverent, and every step away from it felt like a privilege, not a right, like a loan of time, rather than an escape. That night I slept on the stone bench nearest the northern row, the same one Charlie used to sit on when he thought no one was watching, and as I closed my eyes I didn't fear the dreams. I feared waking up and finding the grave filled, because if it wasn't for me, it had chosen someone else.